Welcome to The Explainer, where we take some of the most complex, cutting-edge research out there and distill it into clear, actionable insights. Today, we're unpacking an absolutely massive breakthrough in the world of brain-computer interfaces. It's all based on a fascinating new research paper introducing a framework called MOJO. And honestly, it is radically changing the game for how we decode neural data. Let's jump right in. Okay, I want to start by throwing this provocative question out there. How do we build a ChatGPT for the human brain? I mean, how can we literally teach an artificial intelligence to fluently speak the native, electrical language of our minds? It sounds a bit like science fiction, right? But it's exactly the problem top researchers are solving as we speak.
To answer that question, we really need to start with a quick refresher on brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs. Basically, these are the vital neurotechnologies that take raw neural spikes, the electrical chatter of your neurons, and translate them into real-world physical actions. We're talking about allowing someone to move a robotic arm or type out speech on a screen just by thinking about it.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the brain data bottleneck. Second, learning without labels. Third, we'll formally introduce the MOJO framework. Fourth, we'll dive into the actual testing across multiple species. And finally, we'll look ahead to the Neuro Foundation future.
All right, Section 1, the brain data bottleneck. Let's talk about what's holding us back.
Historically, BCI decoders have relied almost entirely on something called supervised learning. What that means in practice is that every single millisecond of brain data needs a perfectly matched behavioral label. Someone has to sit there and define, okay, the arm moved left at exactly this speed at exactly this time. Gathering that paired data is painfully slow, it's expensive. But on the flip side, we have self-supervised learning. This approach could theoretically ingest the literal mountains of raw, unlabeled brain data that labs have been hoarding for decades. The million-dollar question has just been, how do we actually use it?
Which brings us to Section 2, Learning Without Labels.
This is where it gets really cool. Think of it kind of like teaching a large language model. ChatGPT didn't learn English by reading a dictionary, it learned by playing a gigantic game of fill-in-the-blank across the whole internet. Well, if an AI can look at a sequence of neural signals, have some of those signals hidden or masked, and then accurately guess the missing pieces, it means it has fundamentally learned the grammar of our thoughts.
And that beautifully tees up Section 3, introducing the MOJO framework.
Let me introduce you to MOJO. It stands for Masked Autoencoder-based Joint Training. And it's a revolutionary framework because it doesn't just pick one lane. It jointly leverages both the unlabeled data to understand the raw, underlying structure of the brain and the labeled data to map that structure to very specific physical actions. It really is the best of both worlds.
The actual methodology here is incredibly elegant. It works in 3 steps. First, it takes individual brain spikes and tokenizes them. So it turns them into discrete digital units of information, much like individual words in a sentence. Second, it intentionally masks parts of this data in a latent space, which forces the AI to reconstruct the missing spikes. That is your self-supervised part. And third, simultaneously, it uses those deeply learned, reconstructed representations to predict the actual physical behavior. That's the supervised part.
Now, what's crucial to understand here is that MOJO isn't just one rigid, standalone model. Actually, scratch that. It's more like a universal upgrade. You can plug it seamlessly into various cutting-edge architectures, whether that's attention-based transformers or recurrence-based models like Mamba and GRU. It adds all this massive predictive capability with very little computational overhead. It's super flexible.
Okay, let's get into the hard evidence. Section 4, Testing Across Species.
The researchers started testing with macaque monkeys. If you look at the setup here, the monkey is reaching out to interact with a grid on a touchscreen monitor. This is the random target task. The goal was to track the monkey's motor cortex and see if MOJO could decode the neural signals translating to these specific, randomized screen touches.
Next, they seriously escalated the difficulty. Now the monkey has to trace a specific path through a complex maze, moving from the center outwards to hit a red target. This is a brilliant test because it forces the AI to grasp continuous, complex spatial planning rather than just simple, random point-and-click movements.
But they didn't stop there. To ensure the model wasn't just, memorizing touchscreen physics, they totally switched the hardware. In this setup, the monkey is gripping a physical manipulandum, basically a robotic joystick apparatus, and moving it to guide a cursor from the center out to peripheral targets.
Finally, they combine that physical joystick with the random targeting task, scattering target blocks irregularly across the screen. So by using these 4 distinct physical and digital interfaces, the researchers created a highly diverse, rigorous set of motor decoding challenges.
And the results? They were absolutely definitive. Take a look at these scores, where standard, purely supervised baseline models, like MOJO, hovered around an R-squared accuracy score of 0.88, enhancing those exact same models with MOJO's joint training framework pushed them way past the 0.91 barrier. In every single monkey test they ran, MOJO significantly outperformed the baseline.
But getting motor skills down was just the beginning. They then moved to mice to test visual processing. Here, the mice observed specific visual stimuli, these shifting striped patterns on a screen called drifting gratings. MOJO's task was now completely different. Decode the visual cortex simply based on what the mouse was passively looking at. To set a baseline, they also introduced incredibly simple visual inputs. As you can see, they used a completely solid, blank gray screen and a stark black circle. The goal was to see if the model could decode the distinct neural differences between highly structured, moving patterns and absolute visual simplicity.
Then, they fed the AI sequence stimuli, showing the shifting grading patterns again and immediately following them with a blank gray screen to test temporal changes. And this is where it gets mind-blowing. They proved that a MOJO model initially pre-trained on the neural data of a monkey moving its arm could be successfully transferred over to decode a mouse's visual cortex.
Even down to identifying the exact neural signature of this simple black circle popping up on the screen. MOJO decoded the brain activity with higher accuracy than older, purely supervised methods. Think about that for a second. It learned the core language of the brain so fundamentally well that it worked across entirely different senses and entirely different species.
And I really want you to take a close look at this chart because it reveals an incredible side effect. This is a confusion matrix. The darker the purple square is along that diagonal line, the more accurate the AI's prediction. What this shows is that without any explicit training about anatomy, the AI automatically learned to identify exactly which of the 7 brain regions a neural signal originated from.
And when they grouped those predictions into 3 broader areas, the hippocampus, the thalamus, and the visual centers, look at that result. It yields near-perfect deep purple classification right on the diagonal. This self-supervised learning just organically, beautifully mapped out the brain's physical geography on its own.
So what do you do when your model conquers monkeys and mice? You push the limits even further. They applied MOJO to decode human speech articulation, tracking the human brain as it formulates words like hello.
Using electrocorticography, which is a grid of electrodes placed directly onto the human cortex, MOJO successfully processed the continuous flowing data of human speech. This proves its underlying architecture is universally adaptable, working far beyond just isolated neural spikes.
To sum up this entire testing phase, MOJO's achievements are honestly staggering. It generalizes across species, it extracts deeply interpretable geographical data, but most importantly, it massively boosts decoding performance even when up to 90% of the dataset it's trained on is completely unlabeled. It fundamentally solves the exact brain data bottleneck we started this explainer with.
Which brings us to our final section. Section 5, the Neurofoundation Future.
As the authors conclude in their paper, combining self-supervised and supervised learning paves the way for universal neurofoundation models. Just as large language models learn to universally understand text, these future NFMs will be able to ingest and understand any brain signal from any species for absolutely any task.
Which leaves us with this final, thrilling question for you to ponder. Once our AI models can effortlessly and universally decode the raw data of our thoughts, how will that reshape the human experience? Will we control complex machines with just a whisper of a thought? Will we be able to perfectly map the origins of our memories? The foundation for all of that is being laid right now. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer today, and keep your minds open to what comes next.